Hello.
There's been an awakening. Have you felt it? Luke's eyes jolted open. He looked around. He could feel a swelling in the Force unlike ever before. His 5 fingers pulsed heavily as he tilted his eyes off to the sky above him. It was dark. Where was he? Who had spoken to him? When he first fell asleep, he was inside of the chambers he called his own on Ossus. The training grounds were mostly complete, with the forested area outside of the future temple grounds cleared as needed. As far as he was aware, there weren't any holes in his roof, and well, this wasn't just a hole, it was the entire night sky. Luke outstretched his arm and pulled himself up with his elbows, as he looked at the glowing white floors beneath him. This was certainly unfamiliar. Luke pressed his hands against the surface and lifted himself up, looking around the barren land, hoping to find something of value to tip him off to where he was. He felt a sense of familiarity, but he didn't see it. So where was it coming from? Luke looked to his right, only to see more of the outstretched glowing walkway. He then looked over to his left, where a shadow was standing. Due to him not recognizing the voice, he was hoping it was a Jedi of some sorts, but the black robes weren't exactly the most comforting feeling in the galaxy. He asked the shadow why he was summoned here, and the man slowly turned around and smiled widely. Anakin asked his son if it was alright that they finally paid each other a visit. Well, of course, it wasn't a problem, but there wasn't anything wrong with just giving him a heads up before doing something like this. Anakin laughed a little and stepped towards his son, asking him how he had been. Luke observed the landscape and came back to his father, who had inched a bit closer. He expressed that it had all been well in the years since Endor and Jakku. It was 9 ABY, the war was over, the New Republic was dominant, the Jedi were returning, and he was here, somewhere between time. Anakin nodded, expressing that this was the world between worlds, a place between time and space. He could view any moment in galactic history through the portals inside of here. However, Anakin continued, this wasn't a place meant to be accessed without true connection to the Force and to the methods of the ones who created such a realm. The Jedi had tapped into it on Lothal, and on countless other planets, ones Luke had yet to visit. Point being, as Anakin returned to the first thing he said, telling his son that there had been an awakening, asking if he had felt it. Luke stepped lightly towards the edge, asking his father if he was referring to the rising darkness in the galaxy, and Anakin nodded, to which Luke continued off of. He said that he understood that darkness would return at some point, but it wasn't thick. There was a thin veil that remained. Whether it was present because of the Empire or the dying Emperor, there was a remaining force of darkness in the galaxy. Anakin stopped and watched his son, who locked eyes with him before looking over the edge and down into the nothingness below him. He asked his father why he was brought here. What purpose did it serve? Clearly, there were secrets that he wasn't allowed to share, and if that were the case, then why bring them together? Luke obviously wasn't complaining about seeing his father, but he was curious on why Anakin would waste his energy to have this conversation if he somehow knew that Luke had sensed this awakening. Anakin said that while it wasn't his place to change the future or upset the cosmic sway of the Force, he was here to talk. This awakening was a counter to the rise of what Luke was establishing. Anakin's hands landed firmly behind his back, as he said that the balance he brought wasn't always going to be forever, and what Luke needed to see was just that. The burden he had placed upon himself when he followed the Jedi path was now his to carry. He needed to see this, as Anakin turned to face his son, who had stepped away from the edge and stood meters away from his father. Anakin looked solemnly at his son, telling him that not everything is as it seems. What he sees can be a deception. What he can inherit as a Jedi, as a Skywalker, and as his son would challenge him beyond what most Jedi would ever face. But it was through these challenges that he could forge a Jedi Order for the future, one that could survive and transcend time. Anakin couldn't say much more than vague statements, but he ended it with this. Luke's journey in life had brought himself this far. Don't be afraid to take himself as unserious. Don't be afraid to view things more than once. Don't forget to trust in tradition, but more so himself. Step forward with his heart, not his mind. His intuition would guide him further than he could ever foresee. Luke smiled to his father and thanked him for his kindness. Anakin nodded and told his son to hold on to these moments. When he returned to his own world, he'd have much to complete. They bowed to each other, and Luke jolted awake to the sound of R2 beeping in the background. Luke got up, rubbing his head and straightening out a piece of his hair left hanging horizontally from his pillow. He found the astromech fending off a bird of prey, and Luke laughed to himself before returning to his chambers to prepare himself for the day. A lot of what his father said was vague, and he understood it as Anakin not being able to share too much without upsetting the cosmic balance of the galaxy. Plus, Luke thought to himself, one should never know too much about one's own future. That could be very unhealthy for him. He'd rather find it himself. Today was a new day, and he had much work to do. Luke's interaction with his father within the world between worlds continued to confuse him in many ways. Even though he believed in the sentiment to not take everything at face value, he did question if that could be in relation to what he saw in the world between worlds. While he was familiar with the concept of the world between worlds, thanks to his few interactions with Ezra Bridger, he wasn't fully sure if his interaction with his father was real or just a dream. But Luke continued on as if it were a real encounter. He wanted to believe it was what he experienced, so he continued living his life as if that were the case. Though the statement that started their conversation is what kept Luke most alert. There had been a genuine disturbance in the Force. It was minuscule, but he had felt it. Seemingly, it had affected young Solo too. Ben was a good kid, kind, compassionate, and witty even for his young age. But when he felt anger or was upset, he would break and destroy things with the Force. Despite his mother, uncle, and grandfather all having similar powers to him, he showed off the Force from the youngest age out of all of them. There was something ticking inside of him. It worried Han a bit more than it did Leia. Luke believed, quietly, that this rising darkness was beginning to seep through his nephew's soul, which wasn't actually the case. Maybe not even by intention, but just the mere presence of this poison in the Force was tapping into Ben's mind or subconscious. Luke, still without having filled his training grounds with students, decided to heed his father's words. He would go out to investigate the galaxy for the potential rise in this darkness. It was so subtle, which was the one thing that really bothered him. When he first learned of the Jedi ways, the darkness was everywhere. Following Jakku and Endor, it started to slip away. The Coruscant Civil War was another sign of the changes, and now it was so little, but it could be felt, and that feeling is what brought him discomfort. Instead of going alone on his first journey, he'd bring his friend Han Solo with him. They hadn't spent a whole lot of time with each other in the past few months, and it would be a good chance for them to catch up. They would also be taking the Falcon, which hadn't gotten a ton of use for the past couple years, so it was a win-win for the two of them. They met up on Ossus and went from there, deeper into the Outer Rim and into wild space. Much of their journey was simple. They didn't have a whole lot of pointing towards the Sith. There were a couple encounters with former Imperials, but those little skirmishes never lasted too long. The thing that did become abundantly clear to Luke was how the years had changed them. They now all had new responsibilities to uphold. Han and Leia had their son and the New Republic, while Chewie returned home to find his family, and Luke restarted the Jedi Order. It led to an important conversation between Luke and Han. The two of them had just left another planet in wild space that was connected to a string of events that led from their first interaction with the Imperial Remnant fighters. It was a nothing burger, and it led to no new pathways to defeating this rising darkness. But as they entered hyperspace, Han expressed that he felt fear, and this drew in Luke's attention. They had had these conversations in the past, but they lasted very briefly due to an interruption in varying forms. Han told Luke that he was afraid of what could happen to Ben if he went to Luke's academy. It wasn't the fact that he didn't trust Luke, and the Jedi obviously understood that, but Han was worried because of who Ben's grandfather was, what he was capable of becoming. Luke understood this more than Han knew, because he had those same fears regarding himself. They were just on a big adventure when they first met. Luke was escaping from Tatooine, Han was smuggling his way out of bad deals, and Leia was leading the Alliance. The two of them were just existing, and now their responsibilities had doubled, tripled, and quadrupled. Things weren't the same anymore, and that wasn't a bad thing, but some of it remained concerning. What could happen if Ben followed in his grandfather's footsteps? And Luke promised an alternative where that wasn't possible. As long as they found what they were searching for, whatever it might be, it wouldn't come true. Han's fears were relatively easy to put to rest, but they opened up into what Luke was most afraid of. There was a very small piece of Luke that feared he was throwing his life away for nothing. When the former Grandmaster died, he was told that he was the last of the Jedi. There was a certain burden that sat in that. If Luke gave up or didn't follow the path, then the Jedi way would cease to exist. There was a certain burden that Luke never spoke about or really ever confessed, because how could he? There was always the fear of becoming Vader, like his father, but even more than that, there was the fear of the Jedi path destroying him like it did Anakin. While this was a very basic understanding of Anakin's turn to darkness, it was through the little information that Luke had about Anakin's fall from grace that made him consider this, while Anakin's own actions were his own, not the fault of the Jedi. Maybe he wouldn't fail per se, but what if the Jedi way destroyed him? The burden was enormous, and as he was trying to rebuild it, he was obviously starting from the base roots of the Jedi Order, and he would build off of what worked and what didn't. But this fear was one he expressed to his friend. This didn't make Han uneasy about trusting Ben with Luke, because this was completely understandable. Luke said that he of course wanted to follow the path of the Jedi. It was his decision at the end of the day. But sometimes, in the back of his mind, he worried if this was the right decision. Was he missing out on a life by rebuilding the Jedi Order? This was a path that wouldn't see easy seas. This would be challenging and difficult, and it would take every piece of him to grow this order. This wasn't even considering the trickle of poison slipping into the ocean of the Force. Luke was skeptical about what this darkness could be. At first, he assumed it was another group of dark side users that were inspired by Palpatine. But in the scenario that it was Palpatine, that was an individual who was able to destroy an order with much more structure, being that Yoda served for 900 years as a Jedi in an order with an actual order, Luke was worried. He was just one Jedi Knight fending off the onset of time, giving the Jedi new life and holding back the forces of evil alone. That was a burden that rarely got to his head, but when it did, it lasted longer than he would ever like to admit. But there was some sense of consolation, because Han believed that if there were anyone in the entire galaxy capable of rebirthing this Jedi Order, it was Luke. The challenges that sat ahead of him were daunting, but he had faced bigger ones before. He had to trust what his vision, dream, or close encounter with the Sixth Sense taught him. He took so much of this seriously, and no one could blame him. The burden was extreme to say the least, but he could conquer it. Han, Leia, Chewie, and all their friends believed in him. Han just suggested that Luke take the burden off of his shoulders by loosening himself up from time to time. He didn't have to run himself into the ground by trying to rebuild what Yoda left behind for him. If this magical sect took 25,000 years to build, then surely it wouldn't be fully finished in just one lifetime. Trust his intuitions, listen to his heart, and forge his future for himself. Luke was very appreciative in Han's friendship, and while their expedition together for the few months they were gone resulted in no true revelations, it left Luke more faithful to himself and to the Jedi way. Months would pass by following this, and Luke would continue his own missions. He found great joy in journeying out across the galaxy, but there still remained an issue at the top of his mind. This darkness wasn't going away. His belief that it was a former Imperial remnant was just clearly not true. He also hadn't interacted with his father since the first night he saw him, and now Luke was going to confide in another friend of his. The two of them met up near Nightside Station in the Outer Rim. Ezra Bridger was home from Peridea and spending time with his family, where he belonged. He had spoken to Luke numerous times, and this time, he was here to talk to the Jedi Knight about the darkness they both felt. So much of Luke's journey since he had met his father was releasing the tension he put onto his shoulders. Luke felt such a burden to be a Master Jedi at 30, when he had really two solid training sessions. The first one with Ben inside the Millennium Falcon, and his second one with Yoda on Dagobah. He and Ezra were speaking about their collective experiences with this stench, and what it could be. But early into their conversation, Ezra took the direction of their conversation and completely skewed it. He noted how unlike Kanan, Luke was acting. Obviously, Ezra wasn't naive, but he found it odd how both he and Luke were considerably Boken Jedi, yet acted so differently. It made sense, but there was something about what Anakin said that Ezra picked up on more than anything else. Perhaps Luke's mission wasn't to rebuild the Jedi Order from the blueprints of the old order. They were deep in the middle of a conversation revolving around defeating this evil presence trying to disrupt the balance. Ezra noted that if Luke truly wanted to rid this evil, then perhaps the best path forward was that of a true Jedi. Ezra and Luke had two completely different definitions of a true Jedi, but they were molded in some similar format. Kanan and Kenobi died in self-sacrifice, but their teaching methods reflected much different resolutions from the onset of Order 66. Luke wasn't exactly following, and Ezra pointed it out. Anakin wasn't telling him to reject the Jedi path instilled into him by Yoda or Obi-Wan. He was telling Luke to expand upon it. Think about it. The Old Order had 25,000 years of history. Somewhere in there, they had to have some information on how to defeat the Sith, or the enemy, without actually combating them. Obi-Wan and Kanan surrendered their lives and, in their own ways, led to the destruction of their enemies. It may have taken time to realize, but it still happened. The Jedi way was without conflict, and the first thing Palpatine would have done after he took the temple was destroy information that could be used to defeat the Sith. Ezra proposed that if Anakin was some sort of guardian of the world between worlds, then he knew something. His father was suggesting that he find his own means to defeat the Sith, one that had been forgotten to time, one that required him to break the rules established by Obi-Wan and Yoda. Luke knew that Anakin was one for breaking and bending the rules, all of which eventually leading him to becoming Vader. But there was a point. Anakin wasn't suggesting that he follow his own path. He was insisting that Luke forge a new one, keep the roots of the Order established by the masters who instructed him, because there was legitimacy in their teachings. But Luke shouldn't be looking for evil. He should be searching for new methods to combat it, ones either lost to time or never learned, and use them to find the darkness and eradicate it from its source, without bending or breaking the code his masters followed. However, perhaps it was time to speak to his father once more. It might seem impossible to reach him, but Ezra believed discovering the world between worlds or even another method to getting to Anakin would be worth his time. Luke found this talk to be just as invigorating as the one he had with Han months earlier. He thanked his friend and started on a new quest. Ezra would be a part of it for about a week or so, before he dipped back to the core, where Hera was currently stationed. Luke's journey now consisted of deeper meditations, more intense ritualistic studies, and not just the Jedi path, but the religious sects seen around the galaxy. Much of what he took from his various conversations was that he was limiting himself by searching too deeply into a Jedi code purged by Sidious. While it seemed like the right decision, and he believed in a way that it was, his friends were also right. The foundation of the Order was in his hands, but to establish longevity, he needed to search Force religions across the galaxy and study what they also had to offer, because much of their lessons were different from the Jedi, and that's why they worked. The Jedi had their 25,000 years of established history, while these varying groups were much younger and found ways to base their religion off of similar core values while discovering new powers and uses of the Force. There were several groups around the galaxy founded by former Jedi as it was, who still believed in the core code, but wished to attempt new things. And sure, Palpatine tried to erase the imagery behind the concept of the Force, but he was unable to even with 20 or so years of absolute control over the galaxy. The galaxy was simply too large for him to conquer every religious foe. While this task was difficult on Luke, it led to him finding paths that he wouldn't have found otherwise. With years counting down to the arrival of his first students on Ossus, Luke finally found a place where he could search for his father. It wasn't a former Jedi temple or anything, rather, it was a location belonging to an ancient subsection of the Jedi, which transformed into some priests and priestesses of the Mid-Rim planet off the galactic map. It was just outside of Naboo, and Luke found his entrance into the world between worlds. As he entered, he remembered what Ezra had told him about messing with the past, and being careful with his decisions once he entered. Luke understood, and he had no intentions to mess up by bringing someone dead back to life. He stopped once he walked across the open landscape. His eyes scanned the empty abyss and saw little to nothing. He called out his father's name and saw nothing and heard nothing, so he stepped forward. After what felt like hours, the sound of a lightsaber ignited, and Luke readied himself, igniting his green saber and scanning the area around him. He turned all the way around, saw nothing, and then returned to face his front, where he thrusted his lightsaber up before him to block a strike from a blue lightsaber-wielding individual. It was his father. Luke asked Anakin what he was doing, and his father didn't respond, swinging his lightsaber around behind his back and thrusting it forward. Luke had been prepared for this. All of his studies of the surviving Jedi texts would prepare him for this encounter. He defended his strike and very quickly realized he was not indeed prepared for this. Anakin drove his weapon forward, forcing Luke to retreat. He defended each strike readily, asking his father why he was doing this, but again there was no response. Father and son dueled across the walkways of the distant realm, as they stopped breaking their constant back and forth for Anakin to look at his son. He shrugged his shoulders forward and slowly paced from side to side on the platform. Luke could see his father loading up for another strike, so he raised his saber and waited. Anakin drove forward, and his son extinguished his saber, ducking under the strike and slipping around to the other side, using the Force to shove his father. But it didn't really work. Anakin turned back and grinned, moving his saber aggressively at his son, who defended each strike. Their blades continued to dance across the worlds, lighting them up and giving the plane a sense of life. Both Skywalkers exchanged blows until Luke was able to twist around his father, using his nimbleness to his advantage. However, Anakin had many more years of established Jedi training and war to finish this. He allowed Luke to make his counter before using his own strength to shove him down. Anakin then extinguished his saber and reached his hand out, asking his son if he had learned anything from their previous conversation. Luke took his father's hand and was pulled up, telling him that he believed he had learned something. His father shook his head. Sure, more use of his talent, but what made a Jedi is not his use of combat. Anakin stepped towards his son, telling him that to defeat an enemy, he couldn't go for the route they would most expect. The Force worked in mysterious ways. His decision to journey here was understandable, but he should have been looking for his own alternative means to combat. Luke didn't understand, as he told his father that he was just trying to be prepared. Anakin knew, but he was prepared for the wrong engagement, reminding his son that he needed to not be afraid to view things more than once. His intuition was guiding him well, but there was still more that could be done. Luke shrugged almost frustratedly. What more could he do? Anakin smiled, seeing a lot of his former self in his son, as he told him that to fight as a Jedi was much more than the weapons they held. Standing his ground here was of course a start, but there were many more alternative ways to fighting. Luke asked if he learned that from Obi-Wan, and Anakin smiled from cheek to cheek. Of course he did, but it was still a very useful lesson, and it was very important for Luke to start seeing the benefits of such a lesson. This wasn't a combat of sabers. This new era wouldn't be like the Clone War. It couldn't be. The competition was between masters of the Force, and he needed to start seeing the writing on the wall. There wasn't much more for Anakin to say, except the fact that he loved Luke dearly. Without even having a chance to respond, Luke was flung from the world between worlds, and left with the mission to find out how to defeat an enemy that was unfindable, one that he had to stop through a mastery of the Force. Years of Luke's life would continue to go by, finding him in the year 14 ABY. It had been a few short weeks since he visited the legendary Barrando stages from the planet Doran. Weeks before that, he had interacted with the Great Mothers of Dathomir. They weren't nearly as kind, but they were at least willing to speak to him. The Great Mothers were nothing like Mother Talzin, but they honored her own perception of the galaxy and how she handled outsiders, especially Jedi. Luke wasn't met with hostility, but he also wasn't encouraged to stay for that long. Through all of these meetings and his 2 lessons with his dear old dad, Luke started to concoct his own recipes for the destruction of his enemy. But from now on, it would have to be held on Ossus. His first students were trickling into his academy, and Ben Solo would be among the faces welcome to the training ground. It wouldn't be until 15 ABY, because Ben wasn't allowed to join until he turned 10, but they were closing in on the turn of the year really quickly. Despite having to keep himself grounded on Ossus, Luke had collected journals upon journals filled to the brim with information on how he could defeat the enemy, whoever they were. All of these journals were in his handwriting, used from his time learning about the varying religions around the galaxy and their methods of using the Force. As a teacher, it was his duty to instruct. As a Jedi, it was his duty to protect. His days from now on would have a very select regimen that he followed instantly. He planned it all out before he accepted his first students. Luke would start with an intense meditation, before transitioning into his first lessons. The students would have their tasks for the day, and he would loosely guide them. In the meantime, he'd focus on finding new powers to channel himself into. Luke's obsession with these unique methods of defeating the darkness transformed himself. He was opened up to a whole new perspective on the galaxy and of himself. He continued to change, to evolve, and he never got dragged down to the day-to-day. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with habits and daily rituals, but one could get lost and the time could just speed by. Luke didn't want that to happen, so he focused on consciously acknowledging every new day and learning one new thing, whatever it might be. Skywalker's academy grew in the meantime. His own usage of the Force intensified. He was able to forge a seeing stone on the planet of Ossus, but it wasn't just a seeing stone like the one he had encountered on Tython. This was a nexus of concentrated Force, something he had learned about from a sect of monks in the Abrogado system, as well as his brief interaction with the Singing Mountain clan of Dathomir. He used a concentration of energy on Osis, bundled it up around the Seeing Stone, and then created another meditation chamber, but it was open to the world around it and interconnected with the planet itself. It was the perfect tie, and he used it especially to learn more about the Force and himself. As a year passed by, Luke felt more complete and more understanding than ever before. Ben was now a permanent face within his academy, but Luke had found a connection to this poison. He was able to use ritualistic mechanisms of the Barando sages to influence the Force to connect him to something he wasn't aware of. Through this deep and intense meditation, he found that there was some sort of surviving Sith, with thousands of cultists. Through this revelation, he decided to start a conflict without ever being involved. Luke wasn't visually present on the world, but mentally, he could feel everything. The planet was cold and dark, like the plague of the Force, but it was heightened due to how extreme the concentration of darkness was. Luke moved to the beams of echoes in the Force, using them as a guide, and then he saw an aura of darkness. What Luke saw in his mind's eye was a cloud of black, sitting lifelessly in a hovering position. He had no clue that it was the former Emperor Palpatine. But Luke, through his extended lessons with the Force adepts of the galaxy, twisted his mind to feel the presence of many more Darksiders, plagues on the galaxy. But they weren't like this hovering mass. Luke then projected a piece of himself outwards, using the nexus he had created to portray the dark abyss with the presence of light. And as it happened, he was launched off the Seeing Stone unconscious. In his mind, though, he could see elements of what was about to transpire. On Exegol, Palpatine was hanging from his life support machine. He was focused in the Force, preying on young Solo, believing that he would be the next Anakin Skywalker, especially for this current generation, a powerful Skywalker with an unexperienced Grand Master. If he could defeat Yoda through mental games, then surely he'd have very little issues with cruising through Luke's unorganized order and lack of experience. However, something changed. He felt it and looked down to his thousands of followers around him. They started to charge him, as if he had done something to them. He demanded answers and they didn't give any, as they attacked him for being a Jedi. Sidious used the Force to launch waves of them away from him, but one of the scientists from his lab unplugged his life support system and he raged. He flung electricity through the ground of the temple and tried to kill each of its treacherous supporters. What Palpatine didn't know, and didn't have time to fully analyze, especially in such a fragile condition, was that to the Sith Eternal, he looked like a Jedi. They were feeble of mind. They didn't see Palpatine. They saw a Jedi warlock who had taken over his body, and they had to kill him for having taken control over their Emperor. What Luke did would be comparable to an enlarged mind trick or even a Force projection, but in the end, as a true Jedi, he did not attack. He used the Force for knowledge and defense, and what he was unaware of was how such defense could be used to stop evil. Luke lay knocked unconscious on the ground, and he heard the same few words from afore. "There's been an awakening, Master. Have you felt it?" Luke looked up and saw the young face of his already prized student, Ben Solo, as he asked what he meant. Ben said that there was a swirling or movement in the Force that he felt. Luke pushed himself up and closed his eyes, feeling outwards and noticing the change itself. He didn't know that the final order was completely destroyed through Palpatine's rage. The Sith Lord caved the planet in on itself, trying to once again preserve his own life, something equatable to the burst of energy after his death in the second Death Star, just destroying the planet this time. Ben helped his uncle up and they walked off together. Ben was safe now, but how safe Luke was unaware. His actions had reset the cosmic balance of the galaxy, and what he didn't know was how. It was a long change that wouldn't see its outcome for another couple years. As Palpatine would have been every voice Ben would have ever heard inside of his head, it was the same voice that would have guided Snoke. The Strandcast clone was living out in the unknown regions as a Force adept, not knowing his connection to the former evil Emperor. Sidious planned on influencing Snoke's actions from afar, but with his death coming so prematurely, he couldn't guide Snoke to rise within the First Order or even find placement within it. Palpatine was introducing the clone to the Sith arts so that he could become a Darksider, but now without Palpatine, Snoke was just an innocent man who just liked to learn of the Force in all of its myriad forms. Light, dark, neutral, he loved it all. The collapse of the First Order wouldn't happen for another 2 decades. Before the completion of Starkiller Base, and without Supreme Leader Snoke, there would be a power struggle, and it would start with a family betrayal. Armitage Hux, son of First Order officer Brendel Hux, would murder his own father with the help of Captain Phasma. It would be an event that would turn the entire First Order in on itself, because if the son of an Imperial officer could just kill him, then why not kill each other? Starkiller Base was mere months away from completion, and the First Order would destroy everything they worked so hard for, because Armitage hated his abusive father that much. There would be leaks of the First Order, but the fearsome resistance led by General Leia Organa Solo would put an end to it. Thanks to Kaz Ziono and Poe Dameron, they would find the First Order remnants and defeat them. Palpatine's death would change so much. While there would be need for children stolen during Project Resurrection to be returned, it would all come in due time. Out on Ossus, though, the Jedi were safe. Luke's decision to break the lessons established by the Order of Old, Yoda, and Obi-Wan were integral to changing the galaxy for the better. Ben would never be influenced by the dark side, and he would have a very successful career as a Jedi. Rey and her family would never be burdened by a hunt started by Ochia Bastoon, and she too would eventually find her way into the Jedi ranks, just like Grogu. And Snoke would just remain a mysterious man, one not burdened by the will of his dead creator. He wouldn't ever face injury, and he wouldn't be plagued by death, and he would live out the rest of his life peacefully. Luke would have a few more interactions with his father throughout his life. But here, after years of dedication to the Jedi path, did he see his life's work transforming the future of the Jedi Order. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons:
Edwin Wells, Ozpin, Jack Silver,
General Alexander,
Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rose Bird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Priamark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Ban, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jenny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Unlink66, Bamman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fordo's Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man 3 First Names, Darksaint46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. To me, it makes a lot of sense for Luke to go through the roots of the Jedi Order, because it was established, it stood for 25,000 years, it would make sense for him to go to those roots. Obviously, you see some of that change in Book of Boba Fett when he gives Grogu a choice. The old Order wouldn't have given Grogu that choice. I think that's indicative of Luke's change to the Order as a whole. Here, though, I kind of wanted to show two different things. First being that the problem with Luke's Order wasn't him. It was Palpatine. Palpatine had the experience, Luke didn't. I firmly believe that Luke was just weeding out what worked and what didn't, and he had only one lifetime to do it, and he had like 20 years to do it. The second thing I wanted to show and kind of talk about is this concept that I think would really work well for Luke and canon, is the idea that Luke is subconsciously, but in the back of his mind, worried that he's throwing his life away so that he can be destroyed by the Jedi path. I think there would be a natural rationale for him to fear becoming a Jedi because the Jedi path destroyed his father from what he knows. He doesn't know the whole story, but from what he knows, the Jedi path in some way, shape, or form destroyed his father. And I think having the burden of rebuilding the Order being placed on him by Yoda could be a really cool lead-in to what eventually happens to him in Last Jedi. Him being like, I told myself this would happen years ago and it ended up happening, kind of thing. So that kind of aspect I wanted to include in here with a conversation with Han. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.